Hello and welcome to this recorded webinar for Public Service Operational Delivery Officer. My name is Dominic Green. I'm the Technical Advisor for Business Skills for City and Guilds, and today's session will be looking at the overview of the new assessment plan for the Public Service Operational Delivery Officer. We're then going to look at the requirements for Gateway before moving on to the two new assessment methods. We're going to then give a brief look on grading as well as potential resits. Okay, without further ado, the Public Service Operational Delivery Officer, as far as City and Guilds is concerned, will have a new number for all new registrations, and that new number will be 9717-12. We've got to bear in mind then that the actual standard for this operational delivery officer has not changed, and we need to be clear about that. It's actually only the assessment plan which has been revised only and not the standard. This change was implemented on the 15th of May 2019. So, according to the assessment plan, the length of duration for this particular standard should be between 12 and 18 months. There will be a minimum of 12 months on programme prior to any apprentice going through the Gateway procedure. So what are those Gateway requirements? They haven't changed a great deal from the old assessment plan. The requirements are still to have achieved a level 2 award in operational delivery, the principles, to have achieved the level 3 certificate in operational delivery, and to still have achieved the level 2 qualification in English or maths, or equivalent. So that might be functional skills, GCSEs, etc. This can be evidenced in the usual ways via PLRs or certificates. So what has changed then is that previously it was a showcase portfolio. The new assessment plan has now stated that it should be a portfolio of evidence rather than a showcase portfolio, and we'll touch upon that in a while. Okay, so just to highlight then that endpoint assessment must be completed within a period lasting no more than a maximum of 6 months. This obviously starts once the apprentice has passed through the endpoint assessment gateway. So now moving on to the two new assessments, just to highlight what the old assessments were first of all. In the top right hand corner there you'll see that it was a showcase portfolio of evidence. There was also a work-based project, a presentation and an interview. The two new assessment methods that are going to replace the 4 old ones are in fact a work-based project, which will then be presented by the apprentice, followed by question and answer sessions around the work-based project. The second assessment will be a professional discussion, and this will be underpinned by a portfolio of evidence. The key here is that it's a portfolio of evidence and not a showcase portfolio. The two new assessment methods are indeed separate assessments now, and these can be assessed in any order during the EPA. So a brief look now at the assessment method 1, which is the work-based project plus presentation followed by a Q&A. So the project is compiled after the apprentice has gone through Gateway process. This is something which you'll probably find across many of the new or revised assessment plans. Generally, the thought process behind this is that because it's endpoint assessments, assessments will now take place generally after that Gateway period. So what's to be included in that work-based project and presentation? Ideally, a project subject. The title and scope will be agreed between the employer and the EPAO within 2 weeks of the apprentice entering EPA period. So that means that you will have to acknowledge what the project subject is going to be, what the title of that project is going to be, and actually inform the endpoint assessment organisation within that 2-week period. So as far as training providers or colleges are concerned, etc., I would really stress the importance here of any talent coaches, trainers, assessors, etc. having dialogue with the employer and the learner, the apprentice in question, End of the day, the training providers or colleges, etc., will know that assessment plan inside out. I'm sure the employer will do it to an extent as well, but you can interject if necessary to ensure that the evidence that's going to be generated during this project will indeed be suitable in order to map across to the knowledge, skills and behaviours. So as far as the project's actually concerned, it must be completed and submitted to the awarding organisation within 18 weeks of the EPA start date, and that project should be around 2,500 words. The key really is that work-based project and presentation must evidence those KSBs in the standard assigned to the project. So with that in mind, just going back to what I said before about stressing the importance with the employer and the learner that whatever it is, the evidence that they're generated around that project, it must map across to the KSBs associated to that project. The assessment plan states it's envisaged that the project will typically be completed over 8 weeks and the report write-up will typically take up to 4 weeks. With that in mind, bearing in mind the project needs to be started after Gateway, you're therefore looking at 12 weeks after Gateway in order to successfully complete the project. This is only a guide from the assessment plan and can be tweaked should it require. So the work-based project report, this is actually a key statement to consider taken from the assessment plan, which I thought was of value. The assessment plan states then that the work-based project report will be reviewed for evidence that the KSBs assigned to that project are inherent in the apprentice's practice. So essentially it's going back to what I said before. It should cover the learner's use of different analytical development techniques in the workplace, which would identify and produce key findings and judgments in assessments, how the learners identified gaps and opportunities, and how the learners engaged with clients, obviously their own organisation and other stakeholders. The learners should explain their own critical thinking in both their analysis and generation of the overall findings and recommendations. Again, really striking a chord with what I said before about going back to ensure that the project will generate the correct KSB evidence and cover what's been highlighted there. Okay, so as far as the presentation is concerned, it'll be based on the work-based project and will provide an overview of the project. The presentation is assessed by the IEPA with no requirement for a panel, which should make life slightly easier. The presentation around that work-based project will therefore last about 15 minutes and at the discretion of the IEPA, the Independent Endpoint Assessor, there might be a further 10% of that 15 minutes added to should it be required. It will then be followed by a mandatory 15-minute Q&A session, again with a 10% discretion by the Independent Assessor, and that Q&A session is there to ensure competence is there throughout the work-based project and the presentation. It might be that 15-minute Q&A is actually there to upskill the learner, potentially to get over that boundary mark and to ensure that full competence is there around the KSBs from say pass to distinction, are in fact to get them over the line from potentially a fail to a pass. So that Q&A session really is worthwhile considering to ensure that the learner's prepped for it in order for them to show competence at the highest level of what it is that they've evidenced. So as far as guidance is concerned, that project that the learner will create should be contextualized and be of approximately 2,500 words, again a 10% tolerance. It would be expected it can include rather graphs, pictorial representations, screenshots of any evidence and findings of that particular project, and of course the 2,500 words does not include annex, appendices, etc, etc. That's not to say that the appendix should be used then to essentially throw in extra evidence just for the sake of it. Anything that goes into that appendix must be mapped across to that must be appropriate for the KSBs. If it doesn't map across the KSBs, it shouldn't go in. It shouldn't be used as a dumping ground. It should be there to support the 2,500 word project that the learner's done. The work-based project must cover all the relevant criteria listed in the endpoint assessment plan. So again, can't stress enough, going back to the initial conversation with the employer to make sure it will generate all of that criteria. So essentially, planning that project is key. I would sit down personally with the learner and the employer, carry out an analysis of any project titles they're considering, and map it to the potential evidence used as far as the KSBs are concerned. And those KSBs that the project must cover have been listed below, which I've pulled out of the assessment plan. The structure of that particular report is nothing new really. We would expect to see an introduction, an overview or a background summary of why the learner or the apprentice is undertaking the project, the aims and objectives of the project, how the apprentice has researched the particular project, the outcomes and business implications, how it impacts the business or stakeholders, for instance, any recommendations that the learner has from that project, and of course the learner should conclude, review, success of that particular project. Now, just to point out that ideally the project would come to fruition. Another reason to ensure that you have dialogue with the employer to make sure that the project has potential to come to fruition. With that in mind, if it can't come to fruition, we don't want to be, and we can't be detrimental to the learner, but it will make the recommendations and the conclusions slightly more difficult for that learner to actually carry out if it doesn't. However, we often know that extenuating circumstances happen. It might be that the employer can't afford to put the project into place, and therefore the learner should not be downgraded for that particular reason. So the learner would continue to recommend and conclude as if it would have happened. So what are the examples of project themes? There is a list below of suggestions around what particular projects could be undertaken. Please be aware that if this list, there is nothing on there that the learner can do or doesn't fit their job role, it's not exhaustive. They can create their own project with the employer. So it might be that the process improvement project could be an area that the employer could perhaps begin. So looking at, say, streamlining a process, ways of sharing good practice, upskilling staff and customers on technology, for instance. It might be a delivery of service projects, could be based on areas such as issues relating to modes of delivery, customer service for people with social needs, and of course this list is not exhaustive. We also have a few more titles available, which will be on our website. If you require a list of those titles, if you get in touch with me, I can send them out to you personally. Okay, moving on to the second assessment method. This is a professional discussion underpinned by the portfolio of evidence. Previously in the old assessment plan, it was a showcase portfolio. The new assessment plan states it must be a portfolio of evidence compiled during the apprenticeship programme. So, as with the old assessment method, this new portfolio of evidence will still be completed prior to EPA gateway submission. We just need to remember that it is not a showcase portfolio. So the portfolio of evidence has actually been given guidance. The portfolio of evidence will typically have a minimum of 10 and a maximum of 15 pieces of evidence. The same processes are used as previously. So essentially it's about less is more. It's about gathering the correct pieces of evidence which will map across the best fit to the KSBs. It's about ensuring it's a holistic approach. It's about making sure that those 10 to 15 pieces of evidence have mapped across to all the KSBs required for the portfolio of evidence. So the portfolio of evidence is not assessed independently. It's essentially linked to the professional discussion. The portfolio of evidence, just like the showcase portfolio, should conform to VAX, so it should be valid, authentic, current, sufficient. So the evidence needs to be valid, it needs to be mapped across to the KSBs, it needs to be authenticated to say that it is the learners. The evidence needs to be current, so on programme between month 1 to month 12. It is a bit of a grey area that the evidence would be generated from month 9 onwards as best practice. Different assessment plans often state that this should be the case, and probably because they're making a presumption that month 1 to month 8 would be on programme, learning those knowledge, skills and behaviours, and then obviously as month 9 comes around, then the learner is going to be producing their best. That's not necessarily the case, but generally is. However, it might be the case that the learner has given an opportunity to generate evidence in month 4 or month 5, and they never actually have that opportunity again to redo or come across that form of evidence again. If that's the case, and the evidence is of quality, and it maps across to the KSBs, there's no reason why you shouldn't use it. Essentially, as long as that evidence maps across to the standard, then the evidence is good to be used. Okay, so the performance evidence must be the main form of evidence gathered for the apprentice's portfolio. We want to see different examples of performance, because that will then in turn allow the IEPA to be shown the consistent performance of that particular apprentice in the workplace. A collection of quality evidence based on the workplace, so a variety of different forms of evidence is always nice to see. We've just got to bear in mind then that the new assessment plan has actually stated that reflective accounts and self-evaluation are now not to be included as evidence. What we need to think about there then is what can we use in place of reflective accounts and self-evaluation. It might be that the learner uses case studies, for instance. It might be that feedback is given within a PDP. If the line manager is giving feedback, for instance, then that may well be able to back up other pieces of evidence, such as witness testimonies or observations, providing it's come from the line manager there, and it's part of the PDP. That's absolutely fine, but we can't have generic feedback across the board or assessment decisions being made. Essentially, the apprentice must state why they've used the evidence and how it meets that particular standard. So again, it needs to be mapped across to those standards, bearing in mind that no assessment decision needs to be made. Obviously, going back to the VAX, it needs to be authenticated by a credible person in the workplace, which could be a team leader, a manager, etc. And that evidence generated must show personal development throughout the on-programme period. Appraisals and reviews can be included to demonstrate progression, and evidence of projects, initiatives, working with other teams, etc. can be used also. What we would say is that you can use a variety of formats. It can include written evidence, audio, video, etc. Where you're using audio and video, please be aware that if they are of length, then I would suggest timestamping them. If they are in video format, I would recommend using the standard MP4 format, and to ensure that these files can be opened by the independent endpoint assessor. Practice would be to triangulate evidence where possible. So it might mean that an observation is followed by a professional discussion to show competence, and then any product knowledge might link to that observation or professional discussion is used, which can then in turn map to lots of different knowledge, skills and behaviours within that assessment plan. So examples of evidence types, it might be that the learner is focusing on planning or personal development. They may use reports or documents, minutes of meetings, email trails, etc. Evidence of customer interaction, both internal and external. Evidence of where they've shared good working practice, whether or not that is formal or informal. Of course, observations and witness testimonies can be used. I particularly like observations and witness testimonies, because they do highlight lots of the KSBs together quite often. IT systems could be an area of which the learner uses to ensure that it's covering areas such as filing, selection and use of IT applications, security measures, reporting faulty equipment. As long as it maps across to the KSBs, that's fine. Apprentices can produce evidence from their own job role. This list is not exhaustive. We just need to ensure that the apprentice is contextualizing that evidence. So as far as the question and answers guidance is concerned, we used to be involved with an interview panel on the old assessment plan. That will not happen now. The new assessment plan will be a professional discussion around that portfolio of evidence. So it's a structured discussion between the apprentice and the IEPA. It will last for a minimum of 60 minutes with a 10% tolerance above 60 minutes should it be required. The IEPA will use a question bank to ensure competence is there of that portfolio of evidence via the professional discussion. However, if the portfolio of evidence requires supplementary questions, the IEPA may well also ask these alongside the question bank. The usual rules apply if learners need to apply for further time under the reasonable adjustments policy. What we would say here is that if this is the case, this needs to be brought to the attention of the EPA team at Gateway. So, as far as grading is concerned, it's either a distinction, pass or fail, and apprentices must pass both assessment methods. Each assessment method is worth 50%, but they must pass both assessment methods in order to achieve a pass for overall grading. The same applies for apprentices trying to achieve distinction. Both assessment methods must receive a distinction for that overall grading of distinction criteria. So just some key areas to consider here then. The importance of descriptors within that assessment method. Generally for pass, assessment plan is looking for descriptive evidence. However, as you can see there, under the professional discussion underpinned by portfolio of evidence, I've highlighted there that one of the pass criteria is actually an explain descriptor. So explains an example of when they've gone the extra mile to adapt the delivery service to meet the needs of a different customer, for instance those with disabilities, and that's mapping across to S1 and B6. So we need to be careful about those descriptors, ensure that the learner fully understands the difference between describe and explain, and ensure that there's depth in the evidence where an explanation is required. These descriptors can often be the key to highlight the quality of the evidence required. Essentially get the apprentice to ask the question, how have they gone that extra mile, and how did they adapt the service offered? What were the specific needs of the customers? In this case, this example is that the customers had a particular disability. Moving across to distinction criteria, you'll see that all of them in this case are to be explained rather than described, and obviously that's upskilling from that past descriptor. Just to link together then the past and the distinction here, the previous example discussed can easily be linked with the distinction criteria, so there's a natural progression there from the previous past criteria, which is highlighted with the ring round it. If you look at the distinction criteria here, it explains an example of when they've dealt with a challenging case requiring the individual needs of a customer to be taken into account and how this case was resolved professionally. You will see there that S1 and B6, those assessment criteria covered in the past are actually also covered in distinction. So if the learner is already aiming at distinction criteria, then they are already meeting that past criteria as well. So ensuring that there's depth in the evidence, but what we need to do is ensure the learner focuses on the key words. So in that distinction criteria there, I would say those key words are challenge and professionally. So why was it a challenge for the learner, and how was it resolved professionally? And the learner would need to really delve down quite deep into how it was a challenge and how professional methods were used. Should the learner require a resit, it does mean that the two methods of assessment are independent, and so that an individual assessment may actually be resat. So if assessment method 1 fails and assessment method 2 passes, the learner would simply resit assessment method 1. However, it does mean that the learner's maximum grade there would be a pass, and the apprentice cannot resit to upskill their grade. Once mentioned before, apprentices must achieve distinctions in both assessment methods to receive a distinction overall. If it's the project that fails, then the apprentice would rework the project within a 4-week time frame. So something to consider there to map in, perhaps potentially as a contingency. What supporting documents do we have as far as the new assessment plan is concerned? What's available now is that new assessment plan. Obviously the standard, as the standard hasn't changed. We've got the City and Guilds EPA journey, which you can see a screenshot of there. And we have an EPA interim briefing guide. In November 2019, there will be recording forms available and the full EPA pack will be available. We're currently devising exemplar material to support the new assessment plan, and actually the preparation tool is now available. The date today is the 11th of September and is now available to use. What also will be available, which will be to be confirmed, is a video for employers. That brings the overview to an end. Should you have any queries at all around that new assessment plan guidance, please feel free to get in touch.